San Quentin State Prison sits on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, its walls rising out of the fog like a relic from another century. Built in the 1850s, it is California's oldest prison, and for decades, its death row has been a holding pen for the most violent men in the state. The air inside the death row adjustment unit is stale, heavy with disinfectant, sweat, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights that never truly turn off. This is not a place designed for rehabilitation. It is designed for containment. By the late 1980s, San Quentin's death row housed men who had nothing left to lose. Lifers. Cop killers. Serial murderers. Men whose names carried weight even behind bars. In this environment, reputation is currency, and fear is survival. Every movement, every glance, every whisper, matters. When Richard Ramirez was transferred back into San Quentin's Death Row Adjustment Center, the unit felt it immediately. Ramirez was not just another condemned inmate. He arrived with a reputation that preceded him through every gate and sally port. The Night Stalker. A serial killer and rapist whose crimes had terrorized California. His name alone carried images of mutilation, home invasions, and satanic symbols carved into crime scenes. Guards had seen notorious inmates before, but Ramirez was different. Even among death row prisoners, he was an outlier. The adjustment unit was already tense. The men housed there spent nearly all their time in small concrete cells, emerging only for brief, heavily controlled movement into the tier or day room. The walls were scarred with decades of violence, scratches, dents, dried stains scrubbed thin but never fully erased. Razor wire framed the narrow windows, cutting off any illusion of freedom. On death row, hierarchy still exists, but it follows different rules. Crimes against children sit at the bottom. Inmates convicted of harming children are universally despised, even by murderers. Word spreads fast inside prison, faster than any official paperwork. Files get leaked. Charges get discussed. And when an inmate like Ramirez enters the unit, everyone already knows why he's there. The guards knew it too. Correctional officers tightened procedures when Ramirez arrived. Escorts became more rigid. Doors stayed sealed longer. Movement schedules were adjusted. Officially, this was routine. Unofficially, it was damage control. Officers understood the volatility of mixing Ramirez into a population that included men with their own violent codes and personal lines that could not be crossed. Ramirez himself did nothing to defuse the tension. He embraced the image that the media had built. Long, dark hair falling past his shoulders. Hollowed cheeks. A stare that lingered just long enough to unsettle. He smiled when others avoided eye contact. Sometimes he laughed alone in his cell. He spoke openly about satanic beliefs, about power, about fear. In a place where weakness is hunted, Ramirez projected defiance, and that made him a target. From their cells, inmates watched him. Studied him. Measured him. Some had daughters. Some had nieces. Some had grown up in violent homes themselves and still drew lines they would not allow to be crossed. Ramirez's crimes weren't just known, they were discussed in whispers, in shouts down the tier, in coded language passed during movement. His presence disrupted the fragile equilibrium of the unit. The adjustment center dayroom was the only shared space, a narrow concrete area enclosed by steel fencing and watched constantly from elevated guard posts. When inmates were brought out in small groups, the tension was suffocating. No one relaxed. No one trusted anyone else. Every step echoed. Every clink of chains sounded louder than it should. On the days Ramirez was brought into the dayroom, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped. Bodies stiffened. Eyes followed him. Some inmates turned their backs. Others stared openly. A few smiled, but not in friendliness. This was the kind of smile that carried intent. Correctional officers positioned themselves carefully, hands never far from batons or radios. They had seen violence erupt over less. And they knew that when violence came on death row, it came fast and without warning. Ramirez seemed to enjoy the attention. He paced slowly. He spoke loudly when he spoke at all. He made comments designed to provoke, to remind everyone why he was famous. In a world where anonymity can be a shield, Ramirez rejected it entirely. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be feared. But fear cuts both ways. The more Ramirez leaned into his notoriety, the more resentment built around him. Men who had endured years on death row without incident began to shift their routines. Some started requesting different movement times. Others watched Ramirez closely, memorizing guard patterns, counting seconds between door openings. Inside San Quentin, violence rarely announces itself. It simmers. It waits. The guard sensed it. Reports noted increased hostility, verbal confrontations shouted across the tier, subtle refusals to comply that tested authority. Ramirez's presence was destabilizing the unit, and everyone knew it. But removing him wasn't an option. This was death row. This was where men like him were sent. As days turned into weeks, the adjustment unit became a pressure cooker. Ramirez remained alive, uninjured, but isolated. Even among death row inmates, he stood alone. No alliances. No protection. No one willing to step in if something happened. And in prison, that kind of isolation is dangerous. The dayroom schedule continued. The gates opened and closed. The men moved in their assigned patterns. On the surface, everything looked controlled. Underneath, something was forming. A decision. An understanding. A moment waiting for the right conditions. In San Quentin's death row adjustment unit, violence doesn't need planning meetings or spoken agreements. Sometimes it only needs shared silence, and the knowledge that some lines, once crossed, demand consequences. Richard Ramirez had crossed them long before he ever stepped inside these walls. And soon, the tension that filled the unit would find its release. On San Quentin's death row adjustment unit, survival is not about strength alone. It is about perception. About where a man stands in the invisible hierarchy that governs even the most controlled environments. There are no gangs here in the traditional sense. No yards to claim. No long-term hustle to protect. Death row strips everything down to its rawest form: reputation, crime, and the judgment of other condemned men. Richard Ramirez entered this ecosystem already condemned, twice over. Among inmates, crimes against children occupy the lowest rung. This is not mythology. It is one of the few moral absolutes that survive inside prison walls. Men convicted of murder may still see themselves as soldiers, thieves, or victims of circumstance. Crimes against children, especially sexual violence, are viewed as unforgivable. They erase any claim to respect. They invite punishment. Ramirez's case files were notorious. Not just for murder, but for rape, torture, and the terror inflicted on families in their own homes. Inside the adjustment unit, men spoke about it quietly at first. A sentence here. A detail there. Over time, the details sharpened. Names of victims. Ages. Descriptions that lingered too long in the mind. This information didn't come from guards. It came from inmates who had nothing else to do but read, listen, and remember. Some of the men on death row had children of their own. Others had grown up abused and carried those scars into adulthood. On death row, time does strange things. It amplifies memory. It hardens old wounds. Ramirez's presence reopened them. He didn't help himself. Rather than keep his head down, Ramirez leaned into provocation. He talked. He smirked. He carried himself like someone untouchable. His satanic rhetoric wasn't whispered, it was broadcast. In an environment where humility can be armor, Ramirez wore arrogance like a shield. But shields don't stop knives. The other inmates watched how guards reacted to him. They noticed that officers were alert but not protective. Ramirez wasn't housed in protective custody. He wasn't isolated beyond standard death row restrictions. To the population, this sent a clear message: if something happened, the system might intervene, but it wouldn't prevent it. That distinction mattered. In prison, violence often depends on opportunity rather than planning. Men don't always conspire in groups. Sometimes they simply arrive at the same conclusion independently. Ramirez had crossed a line that many inmates recognized instinctively. The adjustment unit dayroom became the focal point. Movement to the dayroom was tightly controlled, but it was still the closest thing to shared space death row allowed. Men were unshackled. Bodies came within arm's reach. Guards stood watch, but reaction time mattered. Seconds mattered. Inmates began observing patterns. Which guards were slower? Which officers favored which angles? How long doors stayed open? Where blind spots briefly formed? This wasn't a coordinated plot, at least not formally. It was more dangerous than that. It was collective understanding. Ramirez sensed hostility, but he misread it. He believed fear equaled respect. In reality, fear can ferment into rage. When Ramirez laughed at insults or returned stares with a grin, it didn't discourage violence, it validated it. To other inmates, he wasn't strong. He was flaunting immunity he didn't actually have. And death row inmates are patient. They had years, sometimes decades, behind them. No parole hearings. No incentives to de-escalate. Punishment meant little when execution already loomed. One inmate, later identified in investigative reports, stood out. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He kept his routine tight and predictable. Tattoos marked his arms, faded from years of confinement. His crime was violent, but it fit the internal logic of prison morality. He was not reviled. He was tolerated. That distinction gave him space to act. Other inmates didn't encourage him, but they didn't discourage him either. Silence is endorsement on death row. No one warned Ramirez. No one stepped in. The absence of resistance was itself a signal. Guards noticed shifts in behavior but misread their meaning. Increased compliance can be as dangerous as defiance. Men followed orders. Movements went smoothly. There were fewer verbal outbursts. The unit felt calm. But calm on death row is often artificial. Ramirez continued to push boundaries. He made comments during dayroom movement. He stared too long. He spoke about his crimes as if they were accomplishments. In doing so, he stripped away the last layer of restraint that might have protected him. What he didn't understand was this: on death row, violence is not about dominance. It is about correction. Some lines, once crossed, demand response, not for power, but for balance. Ramirez's crimes had unbalanced the moral economy of the unit. His behavior aggravated it further. The day the assault occurred did not begin with chaos. It began like any other day. Doors buzzed open. Chains rattled. Guards called out numbers. Men stepped forward when instructed. But under the surface, something had changed. The inmate who would attack Ramirez had already decided. Not out of impulse, but conviction. He knew the consequences. He knew he would gain nothing tangible. No protection. No privileges. Only retaliation from the system. And he accepted that. On death row, acceptance is dangerous. As Ramirez entered the dayroom that day, he did not notice anything different. The same concrete walls. The same steel fencing. The same guards at their posts. The same inmates positioned along the perimeter. What he didn't notice was the stillness. No whispers. No movement. No eyes looking away. Everyone was watching. And when violence finally came, it would not be chaotic. It would be fast, intentional, and irreversible. The dayroom doors opened with the same mechanical buzz they always did. Metal slid against metal. Chains rattled. Boots crossed concrete. On San Quentin's death row adjustment unit, routine was a form of control. Predictability kept men alive. Guards relied on it. Inmates endured it. That morning, nothing on the surface broke the pattern. Richard Ramirez entered the dayroom under standard escort. His restraints were removed according to procedure. He stepped forward into the fenced concrete enclosure and took his place along the perimeter. Guards positioned themselves at their usual posts, one elevated, one near the gate, another walking the outer edge. Radios crackled softly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. To an untrained eye, it was just another controlled movement. But the atmosphere had changed. The dayroom felt quieter than usual. Not calm, compressed. Conversations didn't restart once the gates closed. No pacing. No posturing. Men sat still, backs against concrete, eyes forward. Ramirez didn't register the silence. He shifted his weight, glanced around, smirked. His posture was loose, almost casual. He had grown accustomed to being watched. To him, attention meant power. He believed his notoriety insulated him. It didn't. The inmate who would attack him was already in position. He wasn't standing close. He wasn't staring. He sat several feet away, body angled slightly off-center, hands resting loosely on his thighs. From the outside, he looked disengaged. Guards had no reason to focus on him. Nothing in his posture signaled imminent violence. That was the point. Seconds passed. Then movement. It happened fast, faster than guards could react, faster than Ramirez could understand. The inmate rose in one smooth motion, closing the distance in 2 steps. There was no warning shout. No verbal exchange. No hesitation. His hand came up holding an improvised weapon, a sharpened object concealed until the last possible moment. Ramirez turned too late. The first strike landed before he could retreat. The impact drove him backward, off balance. He stumbled, colliding with the fencing. The sound cut through the room, metal vibrating, bodies shifting, sudden chaos replacing silence. Guards shouted commands. Inmate down. Get back. On the ground. But the assault didn't stop immediately. The attacker pressed forward, delivering additional blows in rapid succession. Each movement was controlled, purposeful. This wasn't a frenzy. It was execution of intent. Ramirez tried to shield himself, arms raised, body twisting away from the strikes. Blood appeared, dark against prison khaki. Other inmates stayed where they were. No one intervened. No one rushed forward. No one shouted for it to stop. On death row, non-interference is a choice. Guards moved in. Batons raised. Pepper spray deployed. Commands became screams. The attacker was forced back, tackled to the concrete, restrained. The entire incident lasted seconds, but seconds are long enough to change everything. Ramirez collapsed. He slid down the fencing and onto the floor, leaving a smear where he had leaned. His breathing was ragged. His movements slowed. He tried to sit up, failed, then remained still. The dayroom was secured immediately. All inmates were ordered to the ground. Hands behind heads. Legs crossed. Compliance was instant. The violence had ended. There was no need for further resistance. Medical staff were called. Guards formed a perimeter around Ramirez as they waited, weapons still drawn, eyes scanning for secondary threats. The attacker was already separated, face down, cuffed, silent. Ramirez was conscious, but barely. His injuries were severe. Multiple wounds. Significant blood loss. His face was swollen, his clothing soaked. He stared upward, eyes unfocused, lips moving without sound. The man who had once terrorized California lay helpless on a concrete floor, surrounded by the same system he had once defied in courtrooms and interviews. Medical personnel arrived and began emergency treatment inside the unit. There was no immediate transport. Security came first. Every movement was deliberate. Ramirez was stabilized enough to be moved, but not before the full weight of the institution settled in. The day room was evacuated. Inmates were returned to their cells one by one. Doors slammed shut. Locks engaged. The adjustment unit fell into lockdown. Movement ceased. Count was verified and re-verified. The prison shifted into containment mode. News of the assault spread instantly through the tiers. Ramirez had been stabbed. Ramirez was bleeding badly. Ramirez might not survive. Speculation filled the silence. From their cells, inmates listened to radios crackle, boots run, doors slam. No one spoke loudly. No one celebrated. This wasn't triumph, it was resolution. A line had been enforced. Ramirez was eventually transported under heavy guard to an outside hospital. His condition was critical. Surgeons worked to save his life. He would survive, but the damage was permanent. Back at San Quentin, the consequences began immediately. The attacker faced new charges, though sentencing meant little on death row. He was placed in administrative segregation, isolated, stripped of what few privileges existed. But among inmates, his status shifted, not upward, not downward, but settled. The act was understood. Guards conducted investigations. Reports were written. Procedures reviewed. But no procedural failure could fully explain what had happened. This wasn't negligence. It was inevitability. Richard Ramirez returned to San Quentin changed. Physically weakened. Psychologically altered. No longer defiant. No longer smirking. The assault had stripped him of the illusion that notoriety equaled safety. On death row, the system may sentence a man to die, but inmates enforce their own judgments long before the state does. The day room would reopen. The routines would resume. The fluorescent lights would hum again. But the adjustment unit would never forget what happened on that concrete floor. Because in that moment, the Night Stalker learned the one truth every prison eventually teaches. Some reputations don't protect you. They mark you. The lockdown came down immediately. Steel doors slammed shut in sequence, the sound echoing through San Quentin's death row adjustment unit like gunfire. Inmates were secured in their cells within minutes. Counts were frozen. Movement was cancelled indefinitely. The unit shifted from controlled tension to total containment. Inside their cells, men waited. No one spoke loudly. No one shouted. The violence had already passed, and death row understands timing. When something decisive happens, the aftermath is not chaos, it's silence. Inmates lay on bunks or stood at their bars, listening to boots run, radios bark orders, and keys rattle with urgency. The message was clear, something serious had occurred. Guards moved through the tier with heightened alertness. Extra officers were brought in. Supervisors appeared on the unit floor, faces tight, eyes scanning for instability. The assault on Richard Ramirez was not just another inmate-on-inmate incident. It involved one of the most notorious prisoners in America, and the administration understood the scrutiny that would follow. Medical transport had already removed Ramirez from the unit. What remained was blood on concrete, smeared metal fencing, and a shaken sense of control. Correctional staff documented everything. Photos were taken. Witness statements were collected. Every second of the incident was reconstructed from memory, radio logs, and surveillance footage. Questions followed predictable lines: weapon origin, guard placement, response time. But there was another question no report could answer directly: how this had been allowed to happen at all. Inside the cells, inmates processed it their own way. Some sat motionless, staring at walls etched with decades of marks. Others lay back, hands folded, eyes closed. A few watched through the bars as cleanup crews scrubbed the dayroom floor, erasing visible evidence but not memory. No one expressed surprise. The assault did not destabilize the unit, it stabilized it. Ramirez had been a constant source of friction. His presence inflamed resentment and challenged the unspoken moral order of death row. With him removed, even temporarily, the atmosphere shifted. Not lighter. Not safer. Just resolved. Guards felt it too. During lockdown checks, officers noticed fewer hostile stares. Fewer muttered insults. Compliance remained high. In a place defined by extremes, the absence of Ramirez altered the emotional temperature. But fear lingered. If an inmate like Richard Ramirez could be attacked in the most controlled unit of the prison, no one was untouchable. The lesson cut both ways, for inmates and staff alike. The attacker was kept in isolation. He did not resist. He did not speak much. He accepted the restraints, the segregation, the additional charges. His role in the incident was already understood. On death row, explanations are unnecessary. Actions speak clearly enough. Administrators faced pressure almost immediately. Media inquiries followed Ramirez to the hospital. Public curiosity surged. How could one of the most infamous serial killers in history be nearly killed while under constant supervision? San Quentin issued controlled statements. No details. No speculation. Just confirmation of an assault and assurance of inmate safety. Inside the prison, the adjustment unit remained sealed. Days passed before movement resumed. When it did, protocols were stricter. Escorts increased. Spacing widened. Guard presence intensified. The system adjusted, but the underlying truth remained unchanged. Richard Ramirez returned eventually. He came back under heavier restrictions, physically altered and psychologically diminished. The man who once smirked in the dayroom now avoided attention. He no longer postured. He no longer provoked. The unit noticed. Fear had replaced arrogance. In prison, that transformation matters. Ramirez was no longer destabilizing, but he was also no longer dominant. His assault had permanently repositioned him within the hierarchy of death row. Not at the bottom. Not at the top. Just exposed. For the men who watched it all unfold, the incident became part of the unit's oral history. A reminder passed silently through glances and posture. A warning about what happens when lines are crossed too publicly. For the guards, it reinforced a harsher reality: control is never absolute. Procedures reduce risk, but they don't erase human judgment, especially among men who have already been sentenced to die. The lockdown lifted. The dayroom reopened. Concrete floors were clean again. Steel fencing stood unmarked. The fluorescent lights buzzed on as if nothing had happened. But everyone remembered. Because on San Quentin's death row, violence doesn't just injure bodies, it reshapes the balance of power. And once that balance shifts, it never fully returns to what it was before.